It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to Concurrent Session 1.3 of the 5th Education Forum on Transformative Education, co-organized by UNESCO and the Asia Pacific Center of Education for International Understanding under the auspices of UNESCO. Our session today will be on the learning environment, which is an essential determinant of transformative education. My name is Chris Castle, and I'm the Chief of the Section for Health and Education at UNESCO headquarters, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this important session. Before we begin, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping announcements. This session is available in 4 languages simultaneously: English, French, Spanish, and Korean. You can select the language you prefer by clicking the language at the language button indicated on your screen. If you have any questions for the presenters, please use the chat box, which is right next to the live stream screen on the platform. And finally, the session is being recorded and will be posted on the event page for those who didn't have a chance to follow it live. Now, a few words about the rationale and the objectives of the session on the learning environment. We all know that education can only be transformative when learners are healthy, well-nourished, safe, feel valued and acknowledged, and included in the learning community as a full and active member. This implies paying greater attention to the quality of the learning environment and school climate. In this session, we're going to try to identify success factors that effectively facilitate transformations in the learning environment that provide health and well-being, advance sustainable development, and global citizenship. We will discuss enabling factors and remaining challenges requiring further action. During these 70 minutes, we will aim to answer the following 2 questions. First, what are the main components of schools' social and physical environment that contribute to learners' health and well-being, advance sustainable development, and global citizenship? And second, what needs to be transformed in the learning environment, and how can we bring about these changes? So to answer these questions, we have an excellent set of speakers who are joining us today. We will have a mix of presentations followed by a panel discussion where we will consider the topic from a global as well as country perspective. I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Professor Didier Jourdan, who is a professor of education at the University of Clermont-Auvergne, a UNESCO chair for global health and education, and the head of the WHO Collaborating Center for Research in Education and Health. Didier will share an introductory presentation on the importance of creating safe, inclusive, and healthy learning environments for transformative education from the global research perspective. Professor Jourdan, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to contribute to the Forum on Transformative Education and to introduce this session on learning environments. I just would like to share with you 5 ideas. The first one is linked to the fact that health and education are mutually intertwined. You all know that education is at the core of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is directly connected to most of the others SDGs. Talking about education, it's not only talking about schools, it's also taking into account the non-formal education, sports club associations, and the informal education from the family, the friends, the social networks. Thinking of the learning environment, it's having in mind the formal education system, the schools, the non-formal education, and the informal education together. If we focus on schools, we have to make clear what are the reasons why schools have to take health into account. We have to make it explicit from the point of view of the educators and the school system. The first reason is, of course, that poor health inhibits learning. This is the main reason why schools should embrace health-related initiatives. This is to enhance their fundamental task of maximizing learning outcome for students. The second reason is linked to citizenship, because health education is an essential part of the culture handed down from generation to generation in all civilizations. Health education is also a good way to transmit, to share ideas, visions, practice with the family and the wider community. What do we know about health and education and the way in which we could improve the quality of learning and the educational achievements? Research shows that curriculum, teaching and learning are not enough. Educational achievement is also linked to the learning environment and to the relationship between the school, the family, and the community. And evidence show that where there is coherence between the school policies and the practices that promote social inclusion, commitment to education and health, learning outcomes are improved. Social and emotional well-being increases and health risk behaviors are reduced. It means that if we want to empower learners to take informed decisions and actions at the individual, community, and global level, we need to create the conditions for transformative education, which means that we have to work on the teaching and the learning process, but also on the learning environment. The second idea is about learning for health and well-being, to make clear what we are talking about. Learning for health and well-being, it's of course, first of all, giving the means to people to take care of themselves. This is what we call health literacy. This is enabling people to protect and promote their individual health and the one of their family and community. This is being able to understand health advertisement, to understand information from the healthcare system, to be able to make decisions related to their everyday life. But it's not enough. What we also need is to provide people with the knowledge, the skills, the capacities necessary for actively participating in decisions about health as citizens, to contribute to the creation of healthy environment. It means behaving as citizens. Learning for health and well-being, this is health literacy, an instrumental dimension, and citizenship for health. The third idea is linked to the different initiatives that have been developed in various countries on the creation of safe, inclusive, and healthy learning environment from a holistic perspective. There's huge differences between the countries. Everybody knows that the political organization, the level of a decentralization, the priorities, the different contexts, the constraints differ from one country to another. So it means you cannot imagine that there's one approach that could be considered as being universal. One size does not fit all. We could observe that if during a long period of time, most of the initiatives were thematic interventions targeting key issues linked to education, intestinal worms, that is clearly linked to school absenteeism in many countries, nutrition, mental health issues related to the everyday life in schools of children and adolescents. We can observe now that more and more countries and schools are implementing what we are calling setting approaches from a holistic perspective. It means that these strategies, these school policies aim to influence in various ways on policy and practices, reshape environment, build partnership, bring about sustainable change through the school settings. All these initiatives have in common to take into account 6 dimensions, the school policy, the curriculum, and the teaching and the learning, the physical environment, the social-emotional environment, the relationship with the family and the community, and the role of the school health nurses and doctors. These initiatives came from the health sector. This is the case of the health promoting school, or the educational sector, the case of the World School, World Community, World Child, or is rooted in an intersectoral partnership like the FRESH initiative, focusing resources on effective school health or good, healthy schools. But all these initiatives have in common to be based on a holistic perspective, with an intervention on the learning and the teaching on the one hand, and the learning environment on the other hand. To move forward, research helps us to identify the lever for change. Research shows that we need to act simultaneously on policies, structures and systems, practices, and human resources. Concerning the policies, it's not only the curriculum and the educational policies, it's also the mobilization of the civil society, since the expectations, the vision, the representation of the civil society influences, of course, what happens in school. The structural systems are linked to the school management, the special needs students, the relationship with the family. The practices correspond to what has to be done concerning educational practices, but also the intervention practices from the health sector. And of course, the human resources are critical. This is the professional development and the support of the health professionals. Concerning this last dimension, it is really important to have in mind that research shows that the practices, the behaviors, the activity of school staff is not only linked to the guidelines, but also to personal factors, personal choices, and also contextual factors linked to students and the wider community context. Moving forward, it's taking into account all these different factors in order to build the capacity of the school staff. The last thing, research shows that it's difficult to talk about implementation in school systems. Every school is unique. There's huge difference between schools, and it's probably better to talk about improvement of the quality and outcome of the educational service provided to students. We are not starting from scratch. Every school works on the learning environment. What we need is to support every school to improve the quality and outcomes of what they are doing and providing to all the students. To conclude this presentation, I just would like to let you know that there's very and extremely interesting reference, which is the global standards and indicator for health promoting school. You can recognize on the slides the different dimensions I talked about earlier, about the school policy, the social emotional environment, the school physical environment, the health system, the health service, the curriculum, the partnerships. All that things now are organized together in global standards, and you can find on the one hand the standards themselves and also the guidelines for the implementation. And this is extremely concrete. This is concrete standards that help to facilitate the transformation by making clear for every school staff, family, decision makers, what are absolutely critical in terms of a learning environment. This is about the policy related to socio-emotional environment, the capacity building of the professionals, the monitoring. All these standards and indicators are available. I would like just to summarize that what we need to know is that health and education are deeply intertwined, and that to move forward, we need to take into account what is transmitted through teaching and learning, but also the educational, the learning environment. The second idea is that talking about learning for health, it's talking about health literacy, but also citizenship for health. The third idea is that to take into account all we know from research and practice, we need to use a holistic view, trying to influence all the different determinants of the learning environment. The political and strategic level of change are, of course, linked to policies, structures and system, practices and human resources. And you can find success indicators that can effectively facilitate transformation in the learning environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Didier, for that excellent presentation. I particularly liked what you said about the need to take a holistic approach to effectively facilitate transformation in education that promotes health and well-being, and also that focuses not only on teaching and learning, but also on the learning environment. You've really set the scene for our session and the following presentations. Thank you. Now we're going to have a chance to listen to country progress in transformative education, and we will consider the measures required for the creation of a safe learning environment. Please welcome our next speaker, Professor James O'Higgins-Norman. He's a clinical sociologist and professor at the Institute of Education, Dublin City University. He holds the UNESCO chair on tackling bullying in schools and cyberspace, and he is director of the National Anti-Bullying Research and Resource Centre in Ireland. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very nice to join everyone today and to be part of this important event. Thank you for your invitation to participate. Okay, we'll start with the slides there, please, if you want to pop them up. I think they're up there now, are they? So what I'm going to talk about today in terms of transformative education is I'm going to focus in very closely on how we develop a whole education approach to tackling bullying and the progress that we're making in Ireland on reaching our goals around that. Next slide, please. The bullying has been defined in many ways, but the overarching bullying definition that people tend to work out of is that bullying is defined as intentional, unwanted, aggressive behaviour that is repeated over time and involves an imbalance of power or strength. And across the literature, this tends to be the definition that's used most. And while it is useful in many ways, it has been identified as part of our reflections on the UNESCO Scientific Committee in our work in advance of the first International Day Against Bullying in 2020, that there were some problems with this definition, and we consulted with over 60 experts around the world, and this seemed to be a common theme that came back from them. One of the problems with this definition is that it tends to focus on bullying as something that occurs only within a dyad, two opposing forces, a target and a bully, and the relationship between them, whereas most people now would recognize that bullying exists within a wider context of relationships that all contribute and come together in that moment of bullying. Also, the assumption under this definition is that bullying is mostly related to interpersonal and individual traits, and sometimes this results in us tending to pathologize people who engage in bullying behavior or people who are targets of bullying behavior. It is related to psychological deficits in the perpetrator. It is reduced through increased control and supervision, and it can be defined and measured and described by value-free researchers. All of these assumptions underpin that definition that came from Alveus and others, and while it's useful in certain situations, there is an increasing feeling that a lot of the nuances of what happens in bullying, particularly contextual nuances, are not recognized enough. So next slide, please. So moving to the next slide, please. Thank you. So some of the implications for our initiatives around bullying have, because of that definition, have been an understanding that there's a one-size-fits-all in terms of anti-bullying initiatives and education, and that children become subjects rather than collaborators in their own anti-bullying education and initiatives to address bullying. And I think there was a recognition on the part of our scientific committee and the wider experts we consulted that we need to move away from this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all and something that's more holistic, and also moving away from not a whole school approach, because that just puts all the responsibility on one single school to tackle whatever bullying behavior is going on in that school, but to move to a whole system approach And we called that the whole education approach. So moving to the next slide, please. So you'll see in that slide there are 9 qualities or 9 components in a whole education approach. And none of these are more important than the other. It's not a menu that you can select one and leave others out, or where one is more important than the other. All 9 aspects have to be addressed at the same time. And this is a challenge, of course, but we would say from our consultation and our reflections with the scientific community around the world that these 9 components active together will in fact help a whole system approach to bullying and bullying prevention and intervention. So the next slide, please. The first component here is strong political leadership, and this involves leadership coming from the national level down to the school level. And it's really important that we have politicians and government and policymakers who will prioritize bullying as an issue that needs to be addressed in society, and put in place different things to address that at a national policy and regulation level. So next slide, please. So for example, in Ireland, we have done a lot in terms of that over the last 10 years or so. In 2012, the government convened a national anti-bullying forum, which led to the following year the publication of an action plan on bullying and also anti-bullying procedures for primary and post-primary schools. This was followed up by a circular letter to schools, which is the way that schools are governed in Ireland, requiring all schools to comply with implementing the action plan and the procedures. Then related to this, more policy was developed. The government published Children First legislation, which is safety legislation for children in relation to all different types of issues, but bullying was specifically called out in that document. The Department of Education's own child protection procedures also call out the need to address bullying. Then the government published an action plan on online safety, which included cyberbullying among children in schools. And then more recently, the government published, through the Department of Education, the Wellbeing Policy Statement and Framework for Practice, providing an overarching framework in which well-being, including bullying issues, could be addressed. So at a policy level, we have really done really well, I think, so far in Ireland in terms of moving towards a whole education approach. Next slide, please. So the next slide is about the safe school, psychological and physical school and classroom environments. And this is where we want to try and create an environment where learners and whole school community feel safe, secure and welcomed and supported. And again, we've moved towards that in Ireland. Moving to the next slide, where we will, next slide please. Thank you. So what we've done to try and achieve that safe learning environment in Ireland is we've increased provision of counsellors, chaplains and other personal supports in schools, making them as available as possible and as close to the school as possible. Schools are also required to have an anti-bullying coordinator now. We know from our research that only about half the schools have actually achieved that, but we're working on the rest. Pastoral care systems are in place in each of our schools, where tutors and year heads have responsibility for specific class groups and for their well-being and for their safety. And then also there's support from the Department of Education regarding the provision of templates for school climate surveys and whole school initiatives that can be accessed by the school should they wish to use them. Next slide, please. So in terms of the next component from the whole education approach, we're looking at training and support for teachers and other school staff. And this has to be pre and post service. So while student teachers are still training and they need to have input on how to tackle and prevent bullying, and also then afterwards there needs to be ongoing support for them with resources and so on. So we go to the next slide, please. I'll just talk to you a little bit there about the example from Ireland. So we have now in place a dedicated professional development service for teachers, and this includes a whole chunk of resources and training that's available to teachers to take in relation to online safety, bullying and cyberbullying issues in schools. And very specifically, the government established WebWise, which is an online safety resort for schools, and it provides online safety advice to teachers, class plans and other learning materials that can be used in the school. There's also funding for the training of parents and school staff. These have not been very well attended, even though quite a considerable amount of money was provided to train parents across the country and provide education around bullying and cyberbullying in schools. And then also the government funds a national anti-bullying website, tacklebullying.ie, and that website acts as a focal point for everyone in the school system who wants to be involved in or is concerned about tackling bullying and cyberbullying. So moving to the next slide, please. The next slide, please, is on curriculum. Yes, sorry, curriculum learning and teaching. I think we skipped there. So curriculum learning and teaching in order to promote caring school climates is another component of the whole education approach. Schools here need to provide a learner-centered and caring school climate. Curriculum learning and teaching plus teacher-learner relationships are really important in terms of developing that kind of learning climate. So in Ireland, what we've done so far to try and address that is we've made a lot of progress, terrific progress at primary level over the last 20 years in terms of developing learner-centered curriculums. The focus of the classroom at primary level has moved from the teacher to the student and their parents, and a partnership between the three of them. We are much slower at post-primary school, I'm afraid. The government is pushing and trying to lead change in order to make learning at post-primary level more student-friendly and more student-centered. But there is a lot of resistance from stakeholders such as teachers' unions and so on. And there's a very key role here for the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, who are also involved in trying to persuade people to use a different type of curriculum in the future. So there's some work has been done there and some achievements, but there's definitely more to do. So moving to the next slide, please, which is reporting mechanisms for learners affected by bullying together with support and referral services. So our National Action Plan makes schools responsible for monitoring bullying. This is a really important part of the whole education approach. It must be consistent and it must be age-appropriate reporting channels and mechanisms known and accessible to the whole school community. So if you move to the next slide, please. What's going on in Ireland in terms of that is that under our action plan and procedures, all schools are required now to record and report on cases of bullying at board, and the board of management or the board of governors of each school is required to ensure that monitoring takes place. And to a certain extent that has been successful in that we now have every school in the country has a board of management and has an item on its agenda every time it meets bullying and so on. But in fact, there is a big gap between what's happening in the classroom and what bullying actually is recorded formally and goes to the board of management. So to address that now, the Department of Education here has asked the inspectorate, we have an inspectorate who monitored all the indicators around education in Ireland, but they are now monitoring bullying as part of their site visits to schools, and they're trying to, I suppose, help schools to prioritise that type of monitoring in the future. So next slide, please. So in terms of the whole education approach that UNESCO has put out, and the next component is in relation to collaboration and partnership between the education sector and the wide range of partners who impact on the education sector. Collaboration between the education authorities, government and others, and different sectors including health, social services, law enforcement, justice and so on. This is really key. And it must be important. It's also important to involve other relevant stakeholders who can provide resources and support to reduce bullying and cyberbullying, including social media companies. All too often in the narrative around cyberbullying is one where social media companies are kind of demonized as these external organizations who are going to facilitate cyberbullying and unsafe practices against our children. But in actual fact, the vast majority of families now use social media. Social media is part of people's lives, and so social media companies are key partners in addressing this issue of school bullying, and the whole education approach very much supports that. If we move to the next slide, please, I'll just give you two examples from Ireland. So we have developed here at the National Anti-Bullying Centre an anti-bullying and online safety programme called FUSE. It's called FUSE because we're fusing together everyone who's concerned about bullying. parents, teachers, school staff, wider society. And that program was developed with funding and with in partnership from Facebook, the government, and some other charities here in Ireland. And the focus in this program, Fuse, is not so much on bullying prevention, but on resilience, recognizing, responding, and reporting. So increasing self-efficacy so that children are less likely to be able to want to engage in bullying, but also will be better able to recognize it, respond to it appropriately, and report it when it does happen. And then the other initiative here in relation to this particular part of the whole education approach is the National Advisory Council for Online Safety, who are doing great work in that area. Then the next slide, please, is in relation to the involvement of all stakeholders in school community. And again, this is everybody in the school community and outside the school community, but particularly in the school community, needs to be involved in tackling and preventing bullying. Next slide, please. And that, again, the example from Ireland is the FUSE program, which involves parents, school staff, and students designing methods to tackle bullying from within the school themselves. And then I'm just going to finish up then by saying that there's a lot more work still to be done here in Ireland, but we are making great progress in terms of implementing the whole education approach that has been suggested by UNESCO. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Professor O'Higgins Norman, for that great presentation. It's very interesting to see how key recommendations released at the 2020 International Conference on School Bullying are now being applied in practice. We, of course, hope to see more practical applications of the whole education approach to preventing and addressing bullying in more countries. I'd like to remind everyone that the resources related to this approach can be found on the UNESCO website. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our third speaker, Ms. Bolorchimeg Dagva. She is an adolescent and HIV/AIDS specialist at UNICEF Mongolia. She is responsible for programming on adolescent health and development, particularly focusing on adolescent skills for life, mental health, sexual and reproductive health, and with an emphasis on equity and gender mainstreaming. Bolorchimeg will be speaking about Mongolia's response to improving adolescent mental health. Bolorchimeg, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I'm Bolorchimeg, adolescent and HIV/AIDS specialist in UNICEF Mongolia country office. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to be part of this important forum. Mongolia is a vast country with the lowest population density in the world. Population distribution is extremely uneven, with the half of the population living in capital city Ulaanbaatar. Mongolia is a young country with 45% of the population under the age 24 and 15% of the population of adolescents. Unfortunately, many issues related to adolescents' health, education, safety and well-being are not adequately addressed by the government. Mental health of adolescents is one of such overlooked areas. So why adolescent mental health is specifically important for Mongolia? Though the data on adolescent mental health, especially the information on the causes of poor mental health among adolescents, is not sufficient, we have enough evidence to start working in this area. In 2019, Mongolia had the highest suicide rate in the region. The suicide rate is not only high, but also increasing over the time. It's hard to believe that more than 30% of adolescent girls aged 16 to 17 had suicide ideation in 2013. So how we started? We wanted our adolescents to be empowered and skilled enough to confront any risks they face in their life and to be able to face their problems with the skills and to help others, peers and community members to voice their problems and to voice their aspirations. For that, we need to make the environment safe, friendly, and able to respond to their needs. We started to work with the immediate environment, which is schools, primary health facilities, social media spaces, peers, and the families. Enabling environment for advancing adolescent mental health, for sure, was one of the important program areas in Mongolia. Law on mental health and law on child rights were supported by national programs on non-communicable diseases, and national programs on child development and protection. In addition, Ministry of Education issued a policy document on school extracurricular activities. And currently, Ministry of Education is also working on the policy document on promoting mental health in schools. Our strategy on system strengthening included the re-establishment of health education in schools, which started from 2018. This time, health education had mental health as one of the 6 core components in it. We supported this initiative with the teacher training and with the development of the series handouts and additional learning materials for teachers. We also trained health and education professionals on adolescent mental health, and for them to be able to identify adolescent mental health problems, to provide primary level counseling and referring to the higher level of mental health services if needed. We also trained class teachers on adolescent mental health in supporting parents' education. This was a very successful initiative, and it received a lot of positive feedback from parents and teachers. On the health sector side, we are helping government in developing postgraduate training curriculum for adolescent doctors, and also short interactive model for school doctors. Ministry of Education is increasingly recognizing importance of mental health services in schools, especially after COVID-19 related school closure for almost 2 years. This year, Ministry of Education made the decision to have a psychologist in every school. This is a big commitment, of course, and it will not be achieved in 1 year. But we at least started, and currently 9% of all public schools have psychologists. We selected 1 province to ensure that all initiatives supported by UNICEF are fully implemented in all schools of that province. We used strengths and difficulties questionnaire methodology to measure mental health status of adolescents in this province. And we will repeat this survey next year and hope that it will help us analyze the results of our interventions in this province. The interventions in the province were framed by provincial plan of action on improving mental health of adolescents. It included trainings and networking of secondary level professionals, and also trainings of school social workers, school doctors, primary health professionals on adolescent mental health and counseling skills. It also included parents' education component, which was provided through class teachers, and programs on skills building for adolescents through extracurricular activities, and life skills program was also included. Adolescent empowerment and skills building is an important component of our mental health program. In terms of the life skills program, we developed 2 types of the program, one for younger adolescents and one for older ones. It's designed to be implemented within schools, through schools, with the help of the class teachers. It's basically a set of the tasks which designed to be implemented together with the family members for younger ones and together with the peers for the older ones. It's girls in the picture were saying that most important part of this program was finance-related part. Together, they explored and compared different bank deposits terms and conditions, and each of them created bank savings in selected bank. School extracurricular activities are very important platform for us to build skills of adolescents. Therefore, methodologies of running different types of the clubs are also supported by UNICEF program. Latest initiative was on creating self-defense club for marginalized children with embedded psychological component in it for trainers. Peer education on mental health was a new approach for us. Peer education combined with the parents and teachers training was successfully implemented in our geo-focus areas. We also conducted Youth Innovation Challenge in 2017. This one resulted in 19 types of IT-based solutions, which came up after the 72-hour hackathon organized by UNICEF Mongolia. Some IT-based solutions were continued up to the final product and now at the testing stage. COVID-19 exacerbated already existing mental health problems, but on the other hand, it helped also government to recognize the problem and support our initiatives at the national level. Several campaigns on mental health were implemented in the last 2 years. Most interesting one was, to me, World Mental Health Action Day campaign, implemented for 10 days prior to the date of 20th of May 2021. It recruited and engaged young volunteers, involved them in the training, and asked them to disseminate messages and what they learned to their peers and family members. One of the volunteers was proudly explaining how she helped to her friend to talk, and how she helped her to initiate conversation with her mother, who was suffering from alcohol abuse. After a long and emotional conversation, her mother promised to quit alcohol to daughter. I think it's a good result, and it's a good opportunity for us to continue in this direction. So what's next? Of course, our effort in promoting adolescent mental health is a learning process, and a lot more needs to be done. We need to understand what are the underlying reasons of mental health problems of adolescents for better targeting our programs. We need to innovate and invest in adolescent-driven solutions. We need to make sure that sustainability of our existing interventions is ensured. And we need to continue system strengthening, and also we need to be able to monitor the progress. Lastly, one of the biggest priority for us is to increase resources and availability of the funding. With this, I reached the end of the presentation. I wish you all success in your programming on mental health. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bolorchimeg, for the outstanding presentation. I think all of us have understood how more than ever important mental health is for learners around the world, particularly in the aftermath or the ongoing crisis caused by COVID-19. It was very interesting to hear about your cross-sectional and multi-level response to addressing mental health problems of learners. Thank you so much for that important presentation. I also want to thank all three of our presenters once again for their excellent job, and I hope you have learned from and enjoyed the presentations as I have. Now we'll have some time for discussion, and I kindly request all the presenters to turn on their cameras and join me in the discussion. We're going to have 2 rounds of questions and answers, and I'd like to start first with you, Bolorchimeg, and ask, can you please describe your pathway for the creation of an enabling environment that allowed the Mongolian government and stakeholders to start addressing the issues related to adolescent mental health? What were the levers of success or enabling factors for you to leverage the support of government decision makers, various ministries, to work together and undertake a cross-sectoral approach?
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would say that it was important to make the problem to be visual. And because at the time when we started, not everybody was aware about the mental health problems in the country. So UNICEF helped the government to organize first national conference on adolescent mental health, which happened in 2016. And during that conference, we collected all the stakeholders. At the time, like, we couldn't really imagine that it will be very important and very interesting for police colleagues, for example. So we brought all the stakeholders together. We brought also young peoples and listened to them. So I think it was important to start with. Secondly, I'm thinking that participating in all different discussions during the development of national policy documents like law on child rights, national programs on mental health, and also national program on child development and protection was also a very important step. And advocating Ministry of Education in issuing various policy documents on improving child transferable skill was also important, as I think. Also, I think it was important to be consistent with your messages, with my messages, and also with our effort in helping governments to realize the problem. And we've been like presenting in every relevant meetings with the 3 different sectors: health, education, and Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. That's how we helped governments to see the problem. I think that's how we started, and that's what helped us. Thank you.
Thanks very much for sharing that with us. For my next question, I'd like to put this to James. And James, in your opinion, what are the main challenges to implementing the whole education approach to prevent and address school violence and bullying at the country level? We know that the 9 core components of the whole education approach are not a menu or a shopping list from which only some aspects can be selected. But in the case of Ireland, which one of them played a central role that triggered the implementation of the other components?
Thank you, Chris. I think the most important is the national policy, the very first one, strong political leadership. We had, at a time around 2012, we had a government minister for education who was very committed to tackling bullying, and he was the one who animated that space by calling a national anti-bullying forum, which involved all of the stakeholders from all of the different sectors of education and society in Ireland. Key to that National Anti-Bullying Forum was the voice of young people who were directly represented and heard at the forum. And then arising out of that, there was a consultation, a deeper consultation with anybody who wanted to make a submission, which then led to the National Action Plan and following procedures. So that political impetus was key to bringing this to the fore and making it a priority area for our schools. The action plan, the procedures, the direction to all schools, the regulation to all schools telling they had to implement them, really meant that at a policy level and at a national level, there was no ambiguity about our responsibilities and our intentions around school bullying. So I think that's where we started. That's where it started. We had to choose one that would animate the other 8 aspects of the whole education approach.
Terrific, thanks for that, James. And of course, it strikes me that the national policy context was also underscored by Bolorchimeg's example from Mongolia as being critically important as well when it comes to raising questions around mental health. So I think that's a helpful kind of consistency between both what you're both pointing to. My third question goes to Didier, and I'd be remiss, of course, if we didn't mention or talk about COVID-19 a bit further. And this is, as we know, a pandemic that has resulted in an education crisis affecting nearly 1.6 billion children in more than 190 countries around the world. Since April 2020, about 370 million children have missed out on school meals and essential health and support services. Didier, what are you seeing as the key lessons learned from the education sector as a result of the COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very important question. And I think that we have learned a lot from the crisis. I think that we could consider the crisis as a kind of a eye opener. An eye opener, this is a reality that was pre-existing, but that became evident for everybody now, that school are not only a place where people learn, but also a place where people live. And having in mind that children and young people in most countries spend 40% of their waking hours in schools, it became evident that the contribution of schools to education is not limited to what students learn, but also to what they are living and experimenting. And this is what has been described by our two colleagues. To be clear, what are the main lessons? I would say 3 ideas. The first one is linked to the learning loss. It appeared during the crisis that there's a need to improve the quality of the relationship between the schools, the families, and all the other educational institutions, associations, library, clubs, since we are more and more aware now that this is a kind of learning ecosystem that could make possible for all the children to succeed from an educational point of view. And the second thing concerning the learning loss is also, of course, linked to the inequalities. We need to work on the determinants of the inequalities, and especially, of course, the digital divide. So this is the first group, I think, of lessons, the one which is linked to the learning itself, the learning loss. The second is, of course, linked to what has been described previously. This is the impact on mental health and on physical health. Surely, we are more and more aware now that we need to create environments that are positive for the education of the students, knowing that the school environment, it's not only the socio-emotional environment, the physical environment, this is also all the services that are delivered to children and young people in schools. You know, when you close the schools, you lose the school meals, you lose the social services, you lose the vaccination, you lose a lot of different services. So we have to have in mind, schools are also platform for services, especially for for the most vulnerable people. And the third and last thing is about the need, I think, for us to build healthy and resilient schools and societies, and the need to improve the learning for health. So there's 3 ideas, I think, are extremely important, and this is what we learned from the crisis. Over to you, Chris.
Terrific, thanks for that, Didier. And of course, the last thing you said really stood out to me as well. Your point about, you know, the building healthy and resilient schools and learning for health. And I think that's, you know, those services are vitally important, and so is learning about health, not only for those learners, but also because we know, and as you said in your presentation, when children and young people learn in school about health, that gets transmitted back to their families and to their communities, which is also so very important. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to move on now to a second round of questions. And Didier, I'd like to stick with you. As we know, every day, millions of children around the world go to school on an empty stomach, unfortunately. And at the same time, many countries and communities are now facing surging rates of overweight and obese children. So we have this kind of, on the one hand, situations where we know there's problems of malnutrition and lack of access to good, healthy meals. On the other hand, we can see surging rates of overweight and obesity in children. How can education systems support learners to adopt healthy eating and drinking behaviors?
This is also a very, very important question. And following what I already said a couple of minutes ago, I think that we have to have in mind that there's educational responses, but there's also a need to build life ecosystems, life environment in schools and around the school that would help to solve that kind of problems. It's always the 2 dimensions, school as a setting where people are living, and school as an educational setting where people learn. So concerning the education, it's of course obvious. Now many countries have included in their curriculum food and nutrition education, often integrated with health education and physical education. And there is a lot to learn from all these experiences all over the planet. And it is very important, I mean, not always reinventing the wheel, but also to learn from the different experiences in the countries. And you know, when you talk about education, it's not only the teaching in the class. Think of the school gardens. This is evidence-based. Having a school garden influences positively the nutritional behaviors and have an influence on obesity. So, you know, it's about being creative. It's about using the different means we have from an educational point of view to educate and to contribute to the students' development. And this is the same, you know, with the link to the local production of food. It is clearly connected to the education for sustainable development, and it also has an impact on the knowledge, the skills, the capacity of students in terms of nutrition. So first answer, I would say this is the educational one. And the second answer is, of course, linked to the services that we are able to offer in school. Schools are provided food, and the quality, the diversity of this food are also fundamental. And the school feeding program allow to diversify children's diets and to provide critical support for most vulnerable students. You know that for many of them, it is the only nutritious meal in the day. And they also contribute to shape the eating behaviors and the taste with the taste education, with the fact that it's not only theory, it's also practices. So yes, canteens are educational settings. So this is, on the one hand, an educational process, and second, a way to organize the environment and the services around schools that could help to solve the crisis linked to the nutrition, obesity and malnutrition too. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Didier. And of course, one of the things that I really picked up and I think is important is essentially what you're saying when it comes to education about healthy eating and drinking, or school health more broadly. We're really just talking about a key aspect of a good quality education, right? I mean, it's not something that can be separated, even though I think sometimes we still hear discussions about, oh, you know, let's just focus on the basics for education. It's just about, you know, learning, you know, literacy, numeracy, and basic skills. But really what we know is that that's not likely to happen in an optimal way if we neglect the full range of issues relating to a good overall quality education. And I think learning about skills for life, learning how to make healthier choices in life, learning about issues to be more resilient and to withstand mental health along the lines of what Bolorchimeg has been sharing with us, or making sure that the school environment is healthy and free of violence, and that we're addressing and tackling school violence and bullying along the lines of what James was sharing, I think is also just really important. And these things, when they're done, can really be a magnet to attract children to school. Parents want to send children to school when they know they can get a meal, when they know that they'll be in an environment where they can learn free from violence and bullying, or where they know that the school is also looking out for a broader range of issues for their overall sense of health and well-being. So thanks very much for that. I'd like to now move to James and ask you, James, what you would suggest as your succinct recommendations for countries that are planning on adopting the whole education approach to preventing school violence and bullying. In other words, what do you recommend they should start with and pay particular attention to? Because we know that in a lot of different settings, the idea of addressing school health, school violence and bullying particularly, can feel a bit overwhelming or daunting. There's a lot of elements that have to be in place. A lot of different stakeholders and partners need to engage. So what would be your overall advice for getting started?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm just thinking there when you were talking to Didier there about the way that people narrowly focus on literacy and numeracy, and you know, think that this is the way that you know, that these are the most important things in education, and don't realise that in fact those things really won't happen unless a more holistic approach to education is promoted. And it's the same in relation to school violence and bullying. All too often I hear people, colleagues in the university, even say that it's really a niche area, it doesn't affect everyone, and that it's you know, not a core activity of education to be concerned about school violence and bullying. And yet we know from UNESCO's report in 2019 that 30% of all children in the world experience school violence and bullying and cyberbullying, and so that's a pandemic proportions, and it's something which is happening in every school around the globe. So that recognition of the connectedness across the school system, and and the role that every part of the school system and society has to play in terms of addressing violence and bullying and cyberbullying in schools is really, really important. I think there's a really important job to be done around teacher education, pre-service and post-service. We have an ongoing issue, certainly here in Ireland, where the vast majority of teachers come from a particular social class, and they run schools for that social class. If you like, the people who become teachers are the people for whom schools have been successful, and they come back into the system to keep that system going. And that can be problematic in terms of if a teacher hasn't been bullied themselves, if they don't have that empathy for children who are marginalized in one way or another in the school system, that can be hard to get them to see the seriousness of the problem. So we need to find ways of developing more empathetic teachers, and that has to start while they're in teacher education, pre-service, but continue post-service. I think that's absolutely crucial, because ultimately the teachers run the school system, and we need to kind of shake them up a bit. Our experience is that teachers become very defensive and anxious when somebody tries to report bullying to them, or it's almost as if their own teaching and their abilities is being questioned, rather than being proactive and realizing that you know, bullying is something that happens and that they have it within their power to address it. So I think connecting up, getting everyone to see they're all part of the solution. I think focusing on teacher education is really important, and I think then national policy and legislation are key. I would say in Ireland, our research shows that about half the schools are doing really well in terms of implementing a whole education approach, but the other half of schools are struggling, and they're not getting there, and they're tending to. We recently had a parliamentary committee investigate what progress is being made around school bullying, and there was an overwhelming cry from school principals and from school managers to say, oh, we need a new action plan, we need new procedures, we need new national policy, new national guidelines. But to the extent that they were ignoring what they can do themselves and what they should do within the schools. And I think that's a really important thing, is that while we need a national policy, we also need the schools to take responsibility as well. So there's a lot of work to be done there as well. And then core to all of that is we must keep the voice of the child and the young person at the centre of any initiative to deliver transformative education, be it in relation to health or bullying or whatever it might be.
Great, thank you, James. And I'm really glad I was really taken by your example about the teachers and your reference to class. And I think one of the things that we've certainly seen in the Sustainable Development Goals, including for Sustainable Development Goal 4 on a good quality education, is leave no one behind. And so it's really vitally important that we think about the most vulnerable, or children that could be, and learners who could be overlooked for whatever reason, and make sure that we don't inadvertently let those learners slip behind. Everybody has a right to education and shouldn't be denied that right to education for any reason. And so I think it's a really poignant reminder that you share, and I found that particularly interesting and important. And I think also, you know, the other thing, of course, with bullying is that we also have generations of culture and mindset in many, many countries around the world, and we have a lot of evidence to back this up, that it's often just assumed that bullying is a regular part of growing up, and there's really nothing that can be done to address it. And I think that the work that you, James, and others, and the UNESCO reports and partners who've been working to tackle and address school violence and bullying have really shown us that it doesn't need to happen, that there are things that can be done to prevent and address bullying. And so I think that's also something we just always have to remind ourselves about, is that, you know, bullying in schools doesn't have to be the norm. School violence can be addressed and stopped, and we should make sure that we do that. And we have wonderful examples of good practice, including the whole education approach, James, that you shared with us earlier. So thanks very much for that. And I think obviously what we've just been talking about, Bolorchimeg, links very well to your points about adolescent mental health. And so I'd like to turn to you now and just ask you what you would consider to be your key recommendations for countries that are facing, you know, similar problems with regard to adolescent mental health that you described for Mongolia. And again, I'm really struck by how often I see mental health coming up now in conferences and events, and studies, et cetera, that it really seems to be an issue that's being, finally recognized as something really important. And I think also recognized as something that schools have an important role to play. And in your presentation with us, you really shared some exciting commitments that you've helped to secure in Mongolia to do this. What would you recommend for our audience to start with and pay particular attention to when it comes to mental health in schools?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. First of all, I would say that the whole child approach was very useful for us in Mongolia. We used this psychological model and we placed child and adolescent in the center of it. And we thought in the beginning, who is around them, with whom adolescents are interacting. So it was very important to understand what are when and where we can interact with adolescent child so that we can provide necessary support to them when they needed it. Secondly, I would say that discussion with the beneficiaries is very important because we started these trainings for school social workers and school doctors, and then we start we in our province we went there and we started a discussion with them whether it was useful to them and how they are working after the training. And they said that okay, we are not meeting children every day, and those people who are meeting children every day are class teachers. So we need your support in training a class teachers so that they will have the first frontline people who can recognize, who can identify problems with adolescent mental health problems and refer to us if they think that they need our support. So that's how we understand, and we started to develop a module for class teachers, so that through that module we can build their skills on identifying mental health problems among adolescents, understanding what are the adolescent mental health common problem existing in Mongolia, and also to help them to improve parents' education, so that they can involve parents in the school activities through the parent evenings or through the events they are organizing among parents of their students. So I think also talking with beneficiaries, adolescents, was very important, so that we can understand and know whether our services provided to them is really meeting their needs, and whether we are really targeting our interventions successfully. And lastly, I would like to mention what COVID taught to us. It's important to be mindful that some risks, maybe all risks and challenges, also have other side of it. They can also offer some opportunities. When we faced COVID transmission in Mongolia, we've been schools were locked down, and we started to think how to improve our programming in order to operate during this difficult situation. So COVID brought us opportunities to improve our programming. For example, to design the online learning programs. Also, COVID helped our Ministry of Education to recognize that mental health is one of the important priorities in education sector, which needs to be tackled by the ministry. And also COVID also helped us to strengthen our services on adolescent mental health, not only in education, but also in the health sector. So I think that's what I would say, my key recommendations to the countries. Thank you.
That's great. And in fact, you're right, in a sense, if there is a silver lining to COVID-19, I think it's exactly as you say. We're all realizing, or rather being reminded, that good health is more than just the absence of disease. And it's not just a physical health, but it's also a mental health. It's a sense of well-being. And so it's really important to sort of take that message to heart in our thinking and as we go forward. And it's wonderful to hear so much more discussion about mental health as a key part of health and well-being overall. So thanks very much, sorry, I'm tripping up on your name. Thank you very much for sharing the examples that you have, as well as James and Didier for the excellent session and discussion that we've had today. It's time. Sorry, I'm just going to unmute myself. Sorry, I just had a little problem with my mute button there. Just want to say that it's time to conclude. We've had a great discussion with the panelists. I think we can all see a lot of consistency across these different aspects of the learning environment that contribute to learners' health and well-being while advancing sustainable development and global citizenship. We've looked at all of these together. I think it's been fantastic. Be sure and visit the forum webpage for the recording and useful resources that we've been referring to today. And I thank all of you very much for attending this session. Thank you very much.